Sarah Plain and Tall, Chapter 7. We have 3 questions to look at for this chapter. What types of things does Sarah still miss? What are some of the new things that Sarah is experiencing in her new home? Is Maggie helpful, or does she make Sarah sadder? Explain. Explain whether you think she's helpful or makes Sarah sadder. Pause the video, open up to Chapter 7. The dandelions in the fields had gone by, their heads soft as feathers. The summer roses were opening. Our neighbors, Matthew and Maggie, came to help Papa plow up a new field for corn. Sarah stood with us on the porch, watching their wagon wind up the road, 2 horses pulling it, and 1 tied in back. I remembered the last time we had stood here alone, Caleb and I, waiting for Sarah. Sarah's hair was in thick braids that circled her head, wild daisies tucked here and there. Papa had picked them for her. Old Bess and Jack ran along the inside of the fence, whickering at the new horses. Papa needs 5 horses for the big gang plow, Caleb told Sarah. Prairie grass is hard. Matthew and Maggie came with their 2 children and a sack full of chickens. Maggie emptied the sack into the yard, and 3 red banty chickens clucked and scattered. They're for you, she told Sarah, for eating. Sarah loved the chickens. She clucked back to them and fed them grain. They followed her, shuffling and scratching primly in the dirt. I knew they would not be for eating. So it talks about Sarah loving chickens. Maybe that's a new thing she's experiencing. And Maggie gave her some chickens. Was that helpful or making her sadder? The children were young and named Rose and Violet after flowers. They hooted and laughed and chased the chickens, who flew up the porch roof. Then the dogs, who crept quietly under the porch. So the 2 little kids were chasing the chickens and the dogs, and they all hid from the little kids. Seal had long ago fled to the barn to sleep in cool hay. Sarah and Maggie helped hitch the horses to the plow. Then they set up a big table in the shade of the barn, covering it with a quilt and a kettle of flowers in the middle. They sat on the porch while Caleb and Matthew and Papa began their morning of plowing. I mixed biscuit dough just inside the door, watching. So Anna's kind of inside the door watching Maggie and Sarah. This is very important. You are lonely, yes? Asked Maggie in her soft voice. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Slowly I stirred the dough. Maggie reached over and took Sarah's hand. I miss the hills of Tennessee sometimes, she said. Now that was Maggie, not Sarah. So that's Maggie that misses Tennessee, not Sarah. Do not miss the hills, Maggie, I thought. I miss the sea, said Sarah. Do not miss the hills, do not miss the sea. I stirred and stirred the dough. I miss my brother William. Those are 2 things, said Sarah. But he is married. The house is hers now, not mine any longer. There are 3 old aunts who all squawk together like crows at dawn. I miss them too. What would you call that, aunts and her brother? What would you describe those people as, to group them as what types of things? There are always things to miss, said Maggie, no matter where you are. It's a good piece of advice. Is Maggie being helpful or making Sarah sadder here? I looked out and saw Papa and Matthew and Caleb working. Rose and Violet ran in the fields. I felt something brush my legs and looked down at Nick, wagging his tail. I would miss you, Nick, I whispered. I would. I knelt down and scratched his ears. I miss Mama. I nearly forgot, said Maggie on the porch. I have something more for you. I carried the bowl outside and watched Maggie lift a low wooden box out of the wagon. Plants, she said to Sarah, for your garden. My garden? Sarah bent down to touch the plants. Zinnias and marigolds and wild feverfew, said Maggie. You must have a garden, wherever you are. Sarah smiled. I had a garden in Maine with dahlias and columbine and nasturtiums, the color of the sun, and nasturtiums, the color of the sun when it sets. I don't know if nasturtiums would grow here. Try, said Maggie. You must have a garden. So Sarah's learning about new flowers to plant in her garden. There was some old ones she used to have in a garden, but she's going to try some new ones. We planted the flowers by the porch, turning over the soil and patting it around them, and watering. Lottie and Nick came to sniff, and the chickens walked in the dirt, leaving prints. In the fields, the horses pulled the plow up and down under the hot summer sun. Maggie wiped her face, leaving a streak of dirt. Soon you can drive your wagon over to my house, and I will give you more. I have Tansy. Sarah frowned. I have never driven a wagon. I can teach you, said Maggie, and so can Anna, and Caleb, and Jacob. Sarah turned to me. Can you? She asked. Can you drive a wagon? I nodded. And Caleb? Yes. In Maine, said Sarah, I would walk to town. So maybe that's something new that she's going to be experiencing. Here it is different, said Maggie. Here you will drive. Way off in the sky, clouds gathered. Matthew and Papa and Caleb came in from the fields, their work done. We all ate in the shade. We are glad you are here, said Matthew to Sarah. A new friend. Maggie misses her, said Matthew to Sarah. A new friend. Maggie misses her friends sometimes. Sarah nodded. There is always something to miss, no matter where you are, she said, smiling at Maggie. So she remembered that piece of advice. So although she was missing something, when Maggie gave her that advice, was it helpful or did it make her sadder? And explain your thinking. Rose and Violet fell asleep in the grass, their bellies full of meat and greens and biscuits. And when it was time to go, Papa and Matthew lifted them into the wagon to sleep on blankets. Sarah walked slowly behind the wagon for a long time, waving, watching it disappear. Caleb and I ran to bring her back, the chickens running wildly behind us. What shall we name them? Asked Sarah, laughing as the chickens followed us into the house. I smiled. I was right. The chickens would not be for eating. And then Papa came, just before the rain, bringing Sarah the first roses of summer. So go back and answer these 3 questions in your notes. Let's move on to the vocabulary. The dandelions in the fields had gone by. Dandelions is a plural noun. It means plants with flower heads composed of florets. They usually start out yellow, and then they'll turn into those little blowers where you can blow on them, and they'll fly away. That's all the vocabulary for that chapter. Our learning target. I can identify the theme of this chapter. Again, write this down. What is the theme of this chapter? Think about what Sarah learns. This is a theme that's actually stated in the text, so if you read carefully, you'll find it. Find the theme of this chapter, write that down. You actually have 4 questions.